Hi Year 11s, today we're going to be looking at human impacts, which is Unit 4.8 in your textbook of the ecosystems topic. Now we have skipped 4.6 and 4.7 to get to 4.8 and we'll come back to those next week. But human impacts is what we're going to look at first, just a little bit easier to graft your head around, makes it a nice, easier flow throughout the topics. So let's begin with human impacts. This should only be one video in this PowerPoint. There shouldn't be more than one video. Just one continuous video, 9 slides. Let's begin. So first off, we're talking about human impacts. So what are the main impacts that we're talking about when we say human impacts and how humans have this pull on ecosystems? And the key threats to ecosystems that come from humans are habitat fragmentation, climate change, introduced species or pathogens, which are species themselves anyway, and agriculture. They are the four main things that are affecting ecosystems, and we're going to look at them individually in this PowerPoint. So let's start with habitat fragmentation, and that's a terminology that you may not have heard before, but you can kind of figure out what it means by just listening to the name. So habitat, obviously where an organism lives. Fragmentation, breaking up into small parts, and that's exactly what this is. Habitat fragmentation is when natural forests are broken up into smaller, isolated patches of natural ecosystems. So we can see over here, we would have eventually had one large rainforest, or originally had one large rainforest, and over time, thanks to logging and agriculture, etc., we've broken these up, creating all these individual ecosystems now. So there'll be some species living in here, there'll be species living over there. We've fragmented the one habitat and made many smaller ones. Now, because they're smaller, the food chain and food web's obviously going to be impacted quite heavily. And if they're impacted quite heavily, that means that they're not going to be able to sustain the same level of life. They're not going to have as rich a biodiversity as they would have had as one larger fragmentation. The main reason that habitat fragmentation is actually happening is because basically humans themselves are growing and we need more space for ourselves to live, so we're pushing things out and we're trying to take over. Habitat destruction is the main driving factor towards species extinction or endangerment. So the fact that we're doing this and we're making smaller ecosystems and less diverse ecosystems means that we are pushing species towards extinction at a faster rate. Deforestation. So deforestation, again, exactly what it sounds like. We're removing forests. And this is something that shouldn't be new to you. Deforestation is a topic that we've covered in geography and biology for many years throughout your schooling. So for example, in Central and South America, Southeast Asia, Central Africa, large economies, large economies of people, lots of people, and the population just keeps rising. In order to make room for that population, they need to destroy the rainforest. Now, the problem is that destroying the rainforest doesn't just remove habitats. So before we're looking at fragmentation, we're focusing just on the ecosystem and the actual animals that could be impacted. But truth of the matter is, when we actually go through deforestation, it's actually affecting global warming, because trees taking carbon dioxide, they are a carbon sink. They're taking the carbon in, they're removing it from the environment. If we remove those trees, what in that area is left to remove the carbon dioxide? So the carbon dioxide concentration in the sky or the atmosphere actually increases in those areas, which leads to a higher effect of global warming. So deforestation, removing trees, make way for human populations basically. Not only does it destroy habitats and push species to extinction, but actually is having a major effect on global warming as well. Just some statistics on habitat destruction, because that is what the last two concepts have been talking about. And we've talked about this in the last slide as well. Habitat destruction is the main contributing factor towards many species going extinct or endangered. If it wasn't for habitat destruction, we wouldn't have as many species going towards endangerment or extinction. And that's a big point, because I don't know if we've talked about in class the Gaia theory. The Gaia theory is that humans have to protect everything that's on Earth with them, because they make up the entire food chain and food webs that we're part of, and they're helping us to survive. we've gotten to where we are in life at the moment because all those organisms are living with us. If we remove them, who's to say that our current way of life won't collapse because we're missing vital parts of the ecosystems? And that's the Gaia theory. So every species is important, and we can't remove them. And that's why things like when we have malaria and the Zika virus, people think about removing mosquitoes from the picture. And the truth of the matter is that's a very big problem. And you've probably heard the Gaia theory talked about when we talk about bees, and people, well, bees are going extinct very slowly. But if bees go, then potentially pollination of all flowers stop. And if there's no flower pollination, then all of a sudden we lose a vital source of food. So every species matters in the large picture. And while we may not be able to look at the large picture at the time, we just see the small picture and this species needs to go, or there's no point protecting the species. The truth of the matter is that we need to protect every species, and habitat starts with habitat destruction. We need to stop destroying their habitats. Habitats have been cleared for agriculture and urban development. That's the main reason their habitats are cleared away. In the last 50 years, so we're going back to 1950s area, 1960s, there has been as much land cleared as in the 150 years before 1945. And that's a big impact. So in the last 50 years alone, we've done the same amount of habitat destruction as there was in 150 years beforehand. That's crazy. Natural vegetation is obviously vegetation that's natural to the area you're coming from. And it's important that we maintain it and don't remove it and don't destroy it. One of the main reasons to do that is to provide a range of habitats and maintain species diversity in those ecosystems. Another is that vegetation has very deep roots, and those deep roots, when they're going into the ground, help to maintain water table levels, which help making the area too salty or not salty enough, and make it so that those plants and animals can actually survive in that area based on the salt level in the soil. So vegetation helps control those salt levels. It protects the soil because of those roots as well, because you're making that anchorage there, you're kind of making that ground a little bit more stable. Natural vegetation absorbs carbon dioxide, produces oxygen for us, which is always a plus. And by controlling those carbon dioxide levels, that kind of has an effect on global warming, which kind of helps maintain regional rainfall patterns. Now, you probably noticed in the last few years, our weather systems don't really seem like they always used to. Summer was just always hot, winter was just always cold. But we're seeing rain in summer, we're seeing lots of rain in summer, we're seeing lots of rain in spring, and that's because those levels have been changed so much of the carbon dioxide. And that's all because we're removing natural vegetation. So we need to leave natural vegetation to kind of stop affecting the regional rainfall patterns. And lastly, if there's already natural vegetation there, there's less room for weeds to grow, less food sources for feral animals. So it's important natural vegetation is kept for those reasons. But that's also leads us on to the topic of introduced species. Since the European settlement of Australia, there's been many species introduced to the Australian ecosystems. And while we're thinking, oh, fantastic, that's going to go on that Gaia theory, we're having more species in our ecosystem, it has the opposite effect. Those introduced species are competing with our native species for habitats and resources, and therefore removing chances for those animals to survive. Not to mention things like cats, which are directly feeding on them, and they're killing off many of our small marsupials. So feral cats introduced to Australia, they're going around and they're hunting and they're killing lots and lots of our natural native species. Lots of marsupials going extinct for that reason. The more significant introduced vertebrae that we're dealing with in Australia are cats, dogs, foxes, rabbits, pigs, donkeys, goats, cane toads, sparrows, starlings, trout, carp and salmon. All of these species have been introduced to Australia, and they're competing with our native species, pushing our native species to the point of extinction and taking their place. Now, most of the time, those introduced species are only brought to these countries to help control the spread of other organisms. But then they themselves become a pest, and we have that same problem. And that was one of the big things with the Tasmanian tiger. It was hunting crops and things and taking away farmers' lives. So we introduced different animals in to hunt the Tasmanian tiger. Well, now we don't have the Tasmanian tiger, and it's a race to bring it back. These introduced species made that Tasmanian tiger go extinct, along with farmers hunting them. So it's a big problem. Pollution. So pollution is obviously probably one of the biggest impacts that we have. And that's mainly due to the lifestyle we live. And it greatly affects the biodiversity on Earth. So we do that through 4 different ways. So we've got chemical pesticides and insecticides we use. And DDT is a really important one. DDT is a pesticide that was used a long time ago. It hasn't been used in close to 50, 60 years. You've probably talked about DDT in school in your whole life. The problem with DDT was it's a cumulative poison. So we were spraying it on our crops to prevent the crops being eaten by pests. But then other animals would come along and they'd eat those pests or eat those crops. And the more they ate, the more the poison built up in their bodies. And it became really, really dangerous when we found that there was high levels of DDT in humans. So DDT had to be stopped. We stopped using DDT for that reason. Another problem that we've had is acid rain, and acid rain is a big one that we're having on the world at the moment. So we burn fossil fuels almost all the time, and those fossil fuels release sulfur and nitrogen oxides. They mix with falling rain, which forms sulfuric acid and nitric acid, which is basically acid rain. And that causes damage to lakes and forests. It increases the pH levels in the lakes and forests. It makes them more acidic. And because of that, many lakes have lost all the forms of water, all the life forms that live in those water bodies because it's too acidic for them to survive. And that's not a good thing to have. So we're effectively damaging all the ocean and river animals because of acid rain, and that's because we're burning fossil fuels. And you wouldn't think that burning fossil fuels and driving your car is damaging the organisms in the oceans and rivers, but it is. Chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs is what we call them, what we use in aerosols. Again, they're going to react with the chemical ozone layer, and that results in the destruction of the ozone, which gives us less protection from the UV radiation, makes the entire Earth warmer, etc. Sewage. The human population has increased massively over the last 100 years. Therefore, we're using more waste. So our sewage occasionally finds itself into our waterways, and that increases the nitrates and phosphates in our lakes and rivers, which leads to an increase in algae. Those algae block the sea level, or block the sunlight reaching down the lower levels of the oceans, which effectively destroys the seagrass in the water, which is obviously going to be the producer for those ecosystems, which will make the whole food chain or food web collapse. And it's very easy to say, well, we can fix all this, but truth of the matter is, we've seen these habitat destructions and impacts on ecosystems rise as humans have also risen. So, for using Australia as an example, humans arrived in Australia 60,000 years ago, and that led to major changes in existing communities. So, we started to use fire as a hunting tool. And that didn't affect individual species, that affected large areas of landscape. And we've talked about this in class before. The entire Australian bushland is now basically, it thrives under fire conditions, and our plants live in fiery conditions. So that's because the frequently lit fires that happened because we were hunting different animals to survive favoured plants with hard or minimal leaves. Those plants could survive those fiery conditions. Whereas our broad-leaved rainforest trees, well, they obviously couldn't survive those fires, and they went extinct. Now, because those trees went extinct, that's obviously going to be a habitat for something. Those animals start to go extinct, or our native Australian animals start to go extinct that like those trees. Therefore, the populations of animals in Australia also had to change because of us coming to Australia and using fire as a hunting tool. Every time that the environment changes, it leads or can lead to a change in the communities because it's affecting resources such as food, habitat, predators, and disease. And that's exactly what we saw in Australia. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, we've measured those for many, many years. all of a sudden, with a rise in population, a rise in cars being used, and increased fuel being used, there is a slow but steady increase in concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That is undisputable. We have facts for that. We've been measuring those carbon dioxide levels, and it has increased. That means that scientists can now predict that that will increase the average temperature of the Earth because of the greenhouse effect. Now, when going back to our water cycle that we looked at last week, if you increase the temperature on Earth, there's going to be more evaporation. More water is going to start to evaporate, move up and go through that cycle as rainfall, and we're going to end up with higher rainfalls. Okay. So along with higher rainfalls, we've now also got higher temperature, causing polar ice caps to melt, which leads to the overall bodies of water expanding. Also going to be evaporating, but the overall water is going to expand. Why is that a problem? Well, that's going to impact communities on a massive level. Any communities that are on the shorelines are going to basically disappear because they're now going to be underwater. The world's weather patterns they're going to be erratic, basically. And that's all because of human influence on communities. This is a prediction from scientists of what's going to happen, and it has pretty good substantial evidence. And it's all based on the fact that we have watched those carbon dioxide levels increase as humans have